This is why she never felt guilt. Most people look at Lori Vallow Daybell and see a monster or a cult leader or someone lost in a religious delusion. But as a licensed professional counselor, when I look at this case, I don't see a monster. I see a textbook case of spiritual elitism. Standard true crime focuses on the what, the movements, the locations, the grim details of the crimes. But today, I'm looking at the how. How does a mother's brain completely rewrite reality so that she can stay the hero of her own story while the unthinkable happens? We're closing the loop on a psychological mystery. How can a human mind, specifically a mother's mind, completely bypass the survival instinct to protect her own children? I've talked about other cases like this before with the mother and their child, specifically recently the Susan Smith case. But the answer isn't she's evil. The answer is a sophisticated clinical mechanism that allowed her to sleep at night while the world searched for her kids. As an LPC, when I look at this case and the clips, I don't see grief. I don't even see the typical flight or fight response of someone who has lost everything. Instead, I see moral disengagement. This is a clinical concept where a person convinces themselves that ethical standards simply don't apply to them in a particular context. Lori didn't just have a belief system, she had a psychological shield. In her mind, she wasn't ending lives, she was moving spirits by labeling her own children as zombies. Can you imagine? Once you remove the human from the person in front of you, the guilt associated with harming them, it simply vanishes. Today, we're peeling back this victim mask to see exactly where the persona slips and the high conflict personality is revealed. I want to talk about the core psychological indicator here of spiritual elitism. This goes way beyond faith. It's a very specific pathology where an individual uses a belief system to create a hierarchy of human worthiness with themselves at the absolute top. Lori didn't just follow a religion. She believed she was a translated being, an exalted goddess who was above the laws of man and the laws of even God. When someone suffers from this level of spiritual grandiosity, they develop a divine exception. They believe that because their mission is holy, any action taken to achieve it is inherently good. This is why she could smile in that police car. In her mind, she wasn't a suspect. She was a martyr being persecuted by dark spirits. This level of cognitive override is what allowed her to look the world in the eye and feel absolutely no remorse. She wasn't just lying to the police. She had successfully lied to her own conscience. By the end of this clinical breakdown, you won't just understand the Lori Vallow Daybell case. You'll know the 3 psychological red flags of spiritual high conflict personalities. These aren't just traits found in high-profile cases. They're behaviors that manifest in toxic relationships, controlling workplaces, within the family dynamics, and yes, even in the church. You'll learn how to spot ruminative entitlement and a victim-hero pivot and the subtle language of spiritual manipulation. Skills you can use to spot this kind of deception in your own world before it takes root or it becomes dangerous. I'm John Cordray, a licensed professional counselor. I've been doing this since 2007. I spent thousands of hours in the therapy room helping people navigate high conflict personalities that I talk about on my channel. Today, we're taking those clinical tools out of my office and we're looking at one of the most complex psychological files in recent history. Let's dive into this clinical file. To understand how Lori reached a point where her children became obstacles rather than her priority, we have to look at the developmental blueprint. In clinical work, we don't just look at the explosion. We look for the slow burning fuse that led to it. Lori didn't just wake up one morning and decide that she was a goddess. No, this was a calculated decades-long shift in how she processed external validation and then converted it into a dangerous form of internal grandiosity. For years, the world saw Lori as the ultimate version of what society expected. She was a beauty queen, a dedicated mother, and by all outward appearances, she was a supermom. But from a clinical perspective, being a supermom or a pageant queen can sometimes be a mask for a fragile ego that's starving for constant high-level validation. When you're addicted to being seen as perfect by the outside world, you're constantly performing. But what happens when that performance is no longer enough to quiet the internal noise? This is where we see the pivot. As Lori aged, her life circumstances shifted, like for most of us. She went through multiple marriages and the stressors of daily life. The validation she received from being pretty or helpful started to lose its potency. She needed a bigger hit. She needed a reason to feel special that no one could take away. This is the moment, the exact moment where external validation, that need for you to like me, pivots to internal grandiosity, the belief that I'm better than you. In this phase of her development, Lori discovered a tool that is a high conflict personality's best friend. It's called spiritual narcissism. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm talking about religion and spiritual things. Not everybody who is deeply spiritual or deeply believes in God or really values their religion is going to be like this. No. But for Lori, this is what happened. I want to be clear about this clinical term, spiritual narcissism. It occurs when an individual's ego becomes fused with their spiritual identity. It's fused together. Instead of using faith to cultivate humility and service, they use it to gain a sense of specialness and elitism. For Lori, this started with claiming that she had direct access to angels and heavenly visions. As a therapist, I see this as a massive red flag. When someone claims they are receiving private, exclusive instructions from a higher power that contradict the laws of reality, they're effectively removing themselves from human accountability. They're creating a divine exception. If God told her she was a goddess, then the opinions of her family and the concerns of her friends, eventually the lives of her children, were no longer subject to an earthly morality. She wasn't just a religious person anymore. She was a translated being. This is a psychological masterstroke for someone with a high conflict personality because it makes them unchallengeable. If you disagree with her, you aren't just wrong, you are dark or possessed. This is how she began to isolate herself within her own mind long before she ever isolated her children from the world. We have to look at the chronological pathology here. We saw a woman who was once obsessed with the physical appearances, the pageants, the supermom persona, doing all these things for external validation. But then it moved into an obsession with the metaphysical, the prophecy. This transition allowed her to stay at the very top of the hierarchy. If she wasn't the youngest beauty queen anymore, she could be the holiest person in the room. This goddess persona served a specific psychological function. It provided a complete defense against shame. High conflict personalities often have an underlying core, deep, unacknowledged shame. By becoming a goddess, Lori essentially created a reality where shame couldn't touch her. If she failed a marriage, it was because the spouse was dark. If her children were difficult, it was because they were zombies. She used religious revelations as a psychological weapon to elevate herself above societal and moral laws. When you believe you're part of the 144,000 chosen to lead the end times, the speed limit doesn't really matter. The laws of marriage don't matter either. And tragically, most tragically, the sanctity of life doesn't matter. You're no longer bound by the developmental blueprint of a normal human being. You've written your own script where you're the only one who truly exists and who truly matters. This is the internal grandiosity that Chad Daybell eventually stepped into and amplified. He didn't create this in her. He just provided the psychological oxygen for a fire that was already smoldering. He gave her the terms of service for her own narcissism. Hey friends, if you find these deep dive clinical breakdowns valuable and you want to support the channel, I want to invite you to become a channel member. Our members get exclusive channel perks. Thanks for considering. We've mapped out the blueprint, the background, the need for validation, and the rise of the goddess persona. But there is a missing piece to this puzzle that most people overlook. There is a specific invisible line that a high conflict personality crosses, where they move from having a belief to being possessed by it. In my work, we call this the point of cognitive irreversibility. This is the part that keeps investigators and psychologists up at night. At what exact moment does a mother look at her sleeping children and no longer see her flesh and blood, but sees an obstacle instead? I've talked about this type of personality with moms in looking at their children as obstacles before. I talked about it in my recent video about Susan Smith. It's tragic. Most of us have what I call an internal jury. When we have a dark thought or a selfish impulse, our internal jury, made up of our values, our upbringing, our empathy, it deliberates and says, no, don't do that bad thing. It's wrong. But for Lori, the internal jury didn't just reach a verdict. The jury was dismissed entirely. You're out of here. How does that happen? It happens through a process called compartmentalization on steroids. Lori began to live in two different timelines at the same time. In one timeline, she was the mother buying school clothes and making breakfast for her kids. In the other timeline, she was a 144,000 chosen warrior fighting a cosmic war. The danger isn't just that she believed the second timeline. It's that she used the second timeline to nullify the first. This is the first red flag I want you to catch in a high conflict types of personalities. It's timeline displacement. If you're dealing with someone who uses fate or destiny or higher missions to excuse their failure to meet basic human responsibilities, you're likely seeing the first cracks in the foundation. They're beginning to build a world where your reality and your pain simply don't really exist or even matter. But Lori didn't do this in a vacuum, and this is where the mystery deepens. Why did someone like Chad Daybell, a seemingly mild-mannered author, become the psychological oxygen for this fire? As a therapist, I often see what happens when two high-conflict personalities collide. It isn't just a relationship. It is a psychological supernova. Most people think they brainwashed each other, but that's way too simple. What they actually did was perform a reciprocal ego stroke. Chad told Lori she was a goddess, which fed her deepest addiction for validation. In return, Lori told Chad his visions were the ultimate truth, which fed his need for power. They created a reality for two. When you find yourself in a relationship where the outside world is wrong and the only two of you are right, you're in a psychological echo chamber. And here's the question that should make your skin crawl. If you're in that echo chamber, stripped of all the outside perspective, how far would you go to protect that feeling of being chosen? This is the value gap that I want to explore. It's easy to say, I would never do that. No way. But as a therapist, I've seen how slowly the water boils. You know, the frog in a hot pan, right? You know that analogy. It starts with a small lie, a small revelation, a small divine exception, until suddenly the unthinkable is the only logical step left. We're about to dive into the behavioral breakdown of the crimes, but before we do, we have to address the zombie labels one more time. It's just so bizarre. We have to look at it. This wasn't just a weird name. It was a psychological magic trick. In magic, misdirection is when the magician makes you look at one hand while the other is doing all the work. The zombie label was Lori's misdirection for her own conscience. But if she looked at her son and saw a shell inhabited by a dark spirit, a zombie, her brain gave her permission to release him. This is what we call the semantic overloading. She took a word with no emotional connection and then pasted it all over the faces of the people she loved. This is a tactic used by some of the most manipulative figures in history. If you can change the name of the person, then you can certainly change your obligation to them. The final mystery we have to tackle before we look at the trial is the timing. Why did this happen when it did? High conflict personalities often detonate when they face a loss of control. For Lori, her world was closing in. Divorces, financial strain, and the looming threat of being exposed were all closing the doors. When a high conflict personality feels trapped, they don't look for an exit. They look for a reset button. For Lori, the goddess narrative was her reset button. It was her way of saying, none of the earthly mess matters because I'm about to leave it all behind anyway. As we move to the trial, I want you to look for the moments where she tries to hit that reset button again. Look at her face when the evidence is presented. Is she looking at the evidence? Or is she looking at her own reflection in a goddess mirror that she built? The mask didn't just stay in Hawaii. It walked right into the courtroom. And it's still there today, wherever she goes. Let's look at exactly where that mask slips. We have to look at how the developmental blueprint of grandiosity translated into the actual behavior that horrified the world. As a clinician, when I look at the timeline of the crimes and the subsequent trial, I don't just see a series of events. I see the active application of dehumanization. The most chilling aspect of the case is arguably the zombies label that we just talked about that Lori assigned to her own children. This sounds like pure madness or a cult leader, but through a clinical lens, this is a highly effective, devastating defense mechanism. In the therapy room, we often talk about how the brain is wired for empathy, especially the bond between a parent and a child. To override that biological and psychological hardwiring, a person must first perform a mental execution, if you will, of the victim long before any physical harm occurs. By labeling her children as zombies or dark spirits, Lori was engaging in a profound act of moral disengagement through dehumanization. If they're no longer her children, if their spirits have been displaced by dark entities, then she's no longer a mother harming her offspring. In her mind, she is a warrior for light, clearing away the obstacles. This pivot removes the emotional weight of her actions. It silenced the conscience. When you strip a human being of their personhood, you strip yourself of the guilt that comes with harming them. This is the ultimate victim mask. Convincing yourself that you are the one doing the world a favor by removing darkness. It's so sad. We can't talk about Lori's behavior without also talking about Chad Daybell. Many people use the term folie à deux, or a shared delusion, to describe their relationship. But as a therapist, I see something even more calculated. It's that psychological echo chamber. In a healthy relationship, partners act as reality testers for one another. If one person has a radical or harmful idea, the other person provides a balance check. But in the case of Lori and Chad, they did the exact opposite. They created a closed loop of mutual validation. Every time Lori felt a surge of narcissistic entitlement, Chad provided a revelation to justify it. Every time Chad wanted to exert control, Lori provided the devotion to fuel it. This echo chamber amplified their shared grandiosity to a lethal degree. Within this vacuum, their entitlement grew unchecked. They weren't just two people in love. They were two people who had convinced each other that they were the only two real people on the planet who mattered. They were chosen. Everyone else, spouses, children, law enforcement, were merely characters in their divine script. This is why their behavior during the crimes appeared so careless to investigators. When you're in the echo chamber of your own divinity, you believe you're invisible to the consequences of the human world. But the mask didn't just stay in the shadows of their secret meetings. It walked straight into the courtroom. One of the most fascinating parts of being a clinician is watching how high conflict personality reacts when they lose the platform of power. During the trial, many observers were struck by Lori's demeanor. She wasn't the weeping, broken mother the defense might have preferred. Instead, she was often seen smirking, whispering to her attorneys, and even laughing. It's hard to believe what her body language says about her need for control, even when facing life in prison. This is called performative indifference. By refusing to show appropriate grief or remorse, she was attempting to maintain her status as superior to the proceedings. She still had to maintain her image. If she acts like the trial is a joke or an inconvenience, she's signaling that she still believes she's above the court's authority. It's a final, desperate attempt to protect her ego from the reality of her situation. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, her spiritual elitism remains her primary defense. To admit guilt would mean to admit that she isn't a goddess. And for that personality like Lori's, the realization is more terrifying than prison itself. We also see her behavior during the victim impact statements. While the families of her victims spoke of their agonizing loss, can't imagine. Lori often looked away or even appeared bored. This is affective blunting, but it's also a form of continued manipulation. By denying her victims the satisfaction of seeing her break, she is exerting the only form of power that she has left, the power to withhold empathy. This is the clinical file in action. It shows us that her crimes weren't an outburst. They were a logical conclusion of a mind that had systematically removed every human guardrail through dehumanization and an echo chamber of entitlement. As we look at these patterns, it becomes very clear that the danger of a high conflict personality isn't just in what they do, but in how they justify it to themselves. But we can learn from this to protect ourselves from the Loris in our own lives. They are specific markers, behavioral signatures that these personalities leave behind long before the tragedy occurs. But before we get to that, if you value this clinical breakdown, would you hit the subscribe button? It really helps the channel grow. As we close the clinical file on the Lori Vallow Daybell case, we have to look past the headlines and the courtroom drama to find the macro lesson that applies to all of us. This isn't just a story about a cult or a series of tragic events in Idaho. Lori Vallow Daybell represents the extreme lethal end of the psychological spectrum that we actually see every day in high conflict personalities. And that's the danger of unchecked belief structures. In the mental health field, we know that belief, whether it's religious, political, or personal, is often the source of immense strength and resilience. It provides a framework for understanding the world. However, a belief system becomes a psychological danger zone is when it becomes unchecked. A healthy belief structure includes reality testing. It allows for doubt, for outside perspectives, and for accountability. But for someone like Lori, her belief system was designed to be the opposite. It was a closed loop. If you have a belief that you can't be challenged by the facts, by the suffering of others, or even by the laws, you aren't living in a faith. You're living in a psychological fortress. When a high conflict personality builds a fortress out of divine revelation, they are essentially retiring their own conscience. They no longer have to ask, is this right? Should I do this? Instead, they only ask, does this serve my specialness? In Lori's case, her unchecked belief in her own exaltation allowed her to bypass the most fundamental human emotions. This is the ultimate warning sign for any of us. When a person's truth requires them to ignore the humanity of those around them, that truth becomes a weapon. Lori Vallow Daybell isn't a one-off case. She's a case study in how high conflict personalities use righteousness to avoid accountability. In my years as an LPC, I've seen this pattern play out many times in many forms, though rarely as tragically as this one, I admit, thankfully. High conflict personalities often struggle with a deep, fragmented sense of self. To protect that fragile ego, they often adopt a persona of extreme righteousness. This might look like the perfect parent, the most dedicated employee, or in Lori's case, the chosen goddess. This righteousness acts as a psychological alibi, if you will. If I'm the perfect or ordained by God, then any criticism of me is persecution. Any attempt to hold me accountable is an attack. By wrapping her actions in the language of spirituality, Lori created a reality where she was never the villain. She used her perceived righteousness to stay the hero, even as the evidence of her crimes mounted. This is a tactic used by many manipulators. They take a high-value concept like faith or family or justice, and they weaponize it to silence their victims. They don't just want to win. They want to be right on a cosmic level. So how do we spot these psychological red flags in our own relationships? I want to talk about three main ones that I've talked about in this video and how it could apply to you. The first one is a demand for specialness. Does the person believe they're subject to a different set of rules because of their unique insight or status? The second one is the isolation of reality. Do they actively try to discredit anyone who provides a reality check or challenges their narrative? The third one is the dehumanization of others. Do they use labels like dark or zombie or toxic to dismiss the needs and rights of others? When you see these three things combined with a refusal to admit even the smallest mistake, you're likely looking at a high conflict personality who is potentially dangerous. They may not be at the status of Lori, but the psychological mechanics are the same. They're people who have traded their empathy for an ego-driven divinity. This brings us to the most difficult truth of this case. Lori didn't feel guilt because in her mind, she had already been exalted above it. When you truly believe you're divine, and when you believe you're a translated being on a holy mission, the rules of humanity no longer really apply. Guilt is a human emotion tied to human accountability. And by removing herself from that human accountability and placing herself in a divine one, Lori effectively detonated her own ability to feel remorse. She didn't just lose her conscience, she consciously traded it for a sense of power. And that is perhaps the most sobering clinical takeaway of all. The human mind is capable of incredible things, including complete erasure of its own moral compass in exchange for the feeling of being special. To see how these high conflict mechanics play out in a very different context, where a person refuses to accept the truth even when faced with overwhelming legal reality, make sure you watch my next video here. It's very interesting. Now I want to leave you with this question. When does a person's faith stop being a source of comfort and start becoming a tool for destruction?